Good evening. Tonight I'm going to be talking about the summer book, which is by Tove Jansson, who is the writer of the Moomin Troll books, for which she is more famous. Uh, Tove Jansson was the internationally best-selling author of all of these fabulous Moomin books, which I do constantly prescribe to people because I think they're amazing, brilliant, and deeply inspiring. Hello, Cookfield Bookfest. Lovely to see you here this evening. I am going to be talking tonight about the summer book because I feel like we need a dash of summer to cheer us up in this hideous weather. And also, I've just reread this book with my book club at Danny House in Hurstpierpoint, Point. And so it's very much in my mind as a brilliant read. It was so good to go back and read it again. So if anyone joining me this evening hasn't yet read it, you've got to pick it up. It's such a gorgeous, lovely read, nice and short. And it has a foreword by Esther Freud. And it also has an afterword, not in this version because I've got an older one, by the granddaughter who is called Sophia, who's in the actual novel. And she is a fictionalized version of herself. So, to start at the beginning, this is a book about a grandmother and her granddaughter who spend one summer on an island in the Finnish archipelago where they have been for their whole lives and they continue to go for their whole lives. But this particular summer, which was a fictionalized version of true events to some degree, but those true events were scattered over several years, is particularly relevant because the granddaughter's mother has just died. The granddaughter's called Sophia, and we never know how her mother died, but she wakes up one morning, the little girl does, Sophia, who is probably about 8. It's never quite told. And she realizes that there's an empty space in her bed and her mother's not there because she's dead. It's one of those books which is very practical, which is very true of all of Tove Jansson's novels. She writes in a very sparse and direct way, but she absolutely minutely observes everything to do with the seasons, the nature around them, and human interaction. And the reason that I love the book and why all of my book group loved it too is because it has such beautiful descriptions of the natural world. And in a way, it is a paean to the joys and the importance of looking after the natural world around you. When, in a way, maybe it's simpler when all you have is a little tiny island, which is only 1 hectare wide. And you know that you have to look after every single blade of grass and every single little piece of moss. But reading this book makes you want to look after every single little tiny part of the natural world around you. And so even though this in some ways does feel like a book of its time, it was published in 1972, it's still a novel which really speaks to us now in the sense of making you want to seize the ecological baton and look after the world around us. So Tove Jansson, better known for her Moomin Troll books, which I also absolutely love and very regularly sing the praises of, also wrote several adult novels and collections of short stories. And I'll be coming back to this one in a minute, but I'll just tell you about a couple of her other adult books. So A Winter Book is in a way a companion to a summer book. This is actually short stories which were chosen and collected by Ali Smith, who is an amazing writer And she is a massive fan of Tove Jansson's as well. And she loves the Moomins and everything to do with Tove Jansson. She collected and put together a selection of her favourite stories by Tove Jansson into this winter book, which is adult stories again, as is the summer book. And this one, the summer book, is more like an actual novel because it's just about this one summer with the grandmother and the granddaughter. A winter book is more disparate short stories, so it dots around over Tove Jansson's whole lifetime. Similarly, Fair Play is another collection of short stories, which it's a slimmer volume, and this one, well, it actually, hang on, it's called a novel. I take it all back. I see it as a collection of short stories, but it is actually a novel. I do feel that is one of the things about Tove Jansson, is that when she does write a novel, it actually does seem like a collection of short stories. And this one, the summer book, very much is in that vein. By the way, it does have lots of lovely pictures in it too. Look at that fantastic grumpy granny with her young grandchild, and that's very much a flavour of the book, because the granny in this novel is constantly, or not constantly, but very frequently grumpy. And that's one of the things that we loved about it. So yeah, it does feel like short stories, and actually the way the chapters are headed is quite like short stories as well. We've got the morning swim, moonlight, the magic forest, the pasture, playing Venice, dead calm, the cat, the tent, the neighbour, the enormous plastic sausage. Those are the names of the titles of the chapters, and each of these chapters really can be read as a little story in itself, but they do all weave together and describe life on this magical summer island. I must say, this is a really great time to read this book right now when the rain is battering outside and it's really cold and you want to wrap up warm with something cozy. I feel like this could be the kind of coat that Tove Jansson might have worn. Although most of the pictures that you see of her, she's wearing very simple clothes, even though there's a very iconic photo of her with a flowery garland on her head when she's swimming in the sea on Midsummer's Day. So it's a great time to read this book now because it's so cold outside and you really need to cheer yourself up with some lovely sunny reading. This book starts in the spring, when the little girl Sophia wakes up realizing that her mother has died, and you actually never get a sense of enormous mourning going on in the book, but we do know that there is a huge amount of grief between the two characters. There's the 6 to 8 year old granddaughter and the grandmother. We realise that the grandmother is the mother of the girl's father, and it's the girl's mother who's died. And the little girl does quite often completely freak out if anything dies on the island, like a bird. She doesn't want to know because she's obviously horrified by the idea of death. And there's a lot of discussion about heaven, about God, about what it means to die. The little girl, Sophia, says to her granny, "When are you going to die?" And the grandmother says, "Probably quite soon, but that's no concern of yours." So she's very practical. And they're both really fantastic characters. I'm just going to read you a little bit of the book to get a flavour of why it is so wonderful. One of the reasons that I really love it is because it goes into so much amazing detail about nature, about every little tiny spider, ant, and piece of moss which lives on this tiny 1 hectare wide island, which Esther Freud says you can walk around the island, because she went to visit it, in 4 minutes, which she at first finds an absolutely terrifying idea, but she then gradually realizes that she could happily stay there for the whole of the summer and never be bored because there's so much to do. Let me read you a little bit and you will understand. Except for the magic forest, the island became an orderly, beautiful park. They tidied it down to the smallest twig while the earth was still soaked with spring rain, and after that, they stuck carefully to the narrow paths that wandered through the carpet of moss from one granite outcropping to another and down to the sand beach. Only farmers and summer guests walk on the moss. What they don't know, and it cannot be repeated too often, is that moss is terribly frail. Step on it once and it rises the next time it rains. The second time, it doesn't rise back up. And the third time you step on moss, it dies. Eider ducks are the same way. The third time you frighten them up from their nests, they never come back. Sometime in July, the moss would adorn itself with a kind of long, light grass. Tiny clusters of flowers would open at exactly the same height above the ground and sway together in the wind, like inland meadows, and the whole island would be covered with a veil dipped in heat, hardly visible and gone in a week. Nothing could give a stronger impression of untouched wilderness. So that's a message to us from Tove Jansson. Don't walk on the moss because you can walk on it once and it will spring back up. The second time it will come back after the rain, but the third time it will die. And one doesn't really think about that. You think that moss is going to just replenish itself eternally. And I did actually have the great luck when I was little of going to stay on islands in the Finnish archipelago because my mum and dad lived in Finland for a few years when I was aged 5 to 8, because my dad was in the diplomatic service in Helsinki. And we used to go and stay with Finnish friends on their beautiful summer islands. And I really clearly remember the feeling of the moss under my bare feet. And it was so springy and so thick. It was absolutely gorgeous. And it did seem like an absolute natural wonder. And there were also blueberries, which were all over the place in little low bushes, and we used to pick the blueberries and take them home with us. So I have experienced a small glimpse of island life like the one described in this lovely book, which is obviously partly why I love the book so much and why I want to go and live on this island in the middle of nowhere. And when I was discussing this with my book group today, we all talked about times when we've lived in places with no electricity or no water, when we've had to get water from the well, which I did have that experience staying in a place in Finland in a summer cottage in the middle of nowhere. And these experiences are things that are harder to come by these days when everyone's so used to having all mod cons. But I do believe that the islands of the Finnish archipelago are still very much like this. They have very basic amenities. Any Finns out there, tell me if I'm right. So that's one of the things that I love about the book is the singing the praises to nature, but there's also the respect to other human beings as well. And that's something that comes out very much in the way that the islanders treat each other. They give each other respect and privacy. They know that once they're on their own island, they leave each other alone. It's quite a big deal to go and visit each other. And there are a couple of visitors that come in the book. There's a wonderful scene where the residents of the island go out on Midsummer Night, and they are meant to be having somebody round for dinner to celebrate the Midsummer Night, when they're going to light fires and cook fabulous food and make a great, wonderful night of it. But then the guy that's meant to be coming around for supper turns up, and without really saying anything to them, he takes them off on this journey into the ocean, into the sea, and there are all these fires in the distance, and there's some kind of bounty that's fallen off another boat. There's all these crates floating in the sea with bottles in them, and they gradually pick up all the bottles while there's fireworks going off in the distance. And then the guest, who was meant to be coming round for dinner, actually goes off with all the bottles and doesn't share them. Pretty outrageous. So that's one visitor. Then there's also uh, an island nearby to this lovely island where a new resident builds a rather posh and beautiful house, and he makes it all very spanking new, and he puts a lock on the door. And the grandmother in the book is horrified by the fact that everything is locked up, and she actually breaks in with the granddaughter and goes into the house just to explore and have a look. And then hilariously, that is one of the biggest moments of tension in the book, which is not a book of great tension, it has to be said. The owner suddenly turns up and he comes into his house, and the grandmother actually hides and runs away. She's about 84 years old with her granddaughter, who's 6 or 7, and they're both terrified and really embarrassed and think that it's absolutely awful. But then the owner of this wonderful house is incredibly nice to them and treats them as if it's all perfectly okay, which is really rather sweet. But he soon realizes that it's just not the done thing to lock up your house. And there's a really fantastic afterword in the new versions of this book. I don't have it in this copy because this is older. The afterword is written by Sophia, who is the granddaughter who's depicted in this book. There's basically only two main characters, the grandmother and the granddaughter. And the granddaughter, Sophia, writes an afterword in 2020 when the world has gone into lockdown, and she rather fabulously goes into lockdown on this very island for 2 weeks because she wants to meet her new grandchild. And the only way that she can meet her new grandchild is to actually go into lockdown and not see anyone else for 2 weeks. So she goes and lives on the island where she spent the whole of her childhood summers, every summer for probably 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And she goes there on her own. I'm guessing she's probably in her 40s when she goes off to live there. And she has a really fantastic time. And I wanted to just read you a little section of that afterward, because that is a really lovely little description. Hang on, it's going to take me a minute to find it because I don't have it on in my book. I've got it as a quote. So here we are. One year when Tove and Tutti, so that's Tove Jansson, who is the writer of the book, the summer book, and Tutti, who is her long-term girlfriend. By the way, Facebook people, tell me if if I disappear when I go off the page. Hi, Kerry, and hi, Colleen. Lovely to see you both. Kerry, it's great to hear that you frequently gift the book to your friends. It is one of those books that you want to give to everyone you know. So just tell me, if you can, in a minute, Facebook people, if I disappear when I go off the page, because that's just one of those technical things that I don't know how it works. One year, when Tove and Tutti came out to their own summer island, which was further out at the end of the archipelago, someone had broken into their cottage and used all the dry firewood by the stove. The most shocking thing was the lack of concern for the next person arriving, who would surely need to make a fire, possibly to survive. After that, they hung the key outside the cottage door so as not to have to fix any more broken windows, and left clear instructions asking any visitor to replenish the firewood before leaving. So that is a really lovely quote that I think is very profound and important in terms of the message of the book, in a way, in the sense that Tove, when she ended up having her own island where she lived with Tutti, her longtime partner, they always left the key to the house hanging on a peg outside the house because they believed there was no point in locking it up. And they positively welcome guests into the house when they're not there, which I think is a really amazing and lovely aspect of life on the Finnish archipelago. And I'd love to know if there's anyone out there from Finland. I've got a few Finnish relatives who sometimes watch, if that is still the way it works. Because I do believe that even now, the island where Tove used to live is a place where the key is still left on the hook and people can still go inside and leave a message writing in the visitor's book to say that they've been there. It's partly a kind of shrine to Tove Jansson, but it's also a symbol of the freedom and the kind of respect to each other that people in the Finnish archipelago have. So, just to tell you a little bit more about some of the other aspects of this fabulous book, um, there are a few other characters within the book apart from the grandmother and the grandchild. There is a cat. There's a kind of rather proud cat who loves hunting and doesn't act like a kind of lap loving cat at all. And the little girl at first hates the cat and wants to have a nice soft purring cat instead. And she actually manages to swap the hunting non-human loving cat for a purry friendly cat. And then she realizes that she actually did love the hunting cat much more. So that's a rather fabulous story. There's also another character in the book, which is the robe. So the robe is her father's robe that he wears all the time. It's a special bathrobe that he loved. It reached all the way to his feet and was made of very thick, stiff flannel that salt water, soil, and time had rendered even stiffer. The robe was probably German originally and had once been green. On its front, it still bore the remains of an intricate system of laces, along with a couple of large, dark amber buttons. Thrown wide open, the robe was as broad as a tent. In the beginning, when Papa was a young man, he used to sit out on the point in his bathrobe whenever it stormed and watch the waves. Later, it was nice to put on when he wanted to work or get warm or simply hide. The robe had survived various threats to its existence. There was the time some well-meaning relatives came out and as a surprise gave the island a good cleaning. They threw out a lot of things the family wanted, but worst of all, they carried the bathrobe down to the water and let it float away. They claimed later that it smelled. Of course it smelled. That was part of its charm. Smell is important. It reminds a person of all the things he's been through. It is a sheath of memories and security. The robe smelled of good things too, of smoke and the sea, but maybe they never noticed that. In any case, the robe came back. The wind blew, shifted and reversed. The waves beat against the island, and one fine day they brought it home. After that, it smelled of seaweed, and Papa wore virtually nothing else that whole summer. Then there was the spring when they discovered a family of mice had been living in the robe. The collar was edged with a soft, downy material that the mice had nibbled off and used for bedclothes, along with some finely chewed handkerchiefs. And then one time, Papa slept too close to the fire and the robe was scorched. And so it goes on. So there's the robe, which is a character in the book, and that gets mentioned a few times. There's Berenice, who is a little girl that comes to stay with Sophia, who's the granddaughter, and to be her companion. But Berenice is a completely urban child who hates insects, hates the great outdoors, is generally horrified by everything, disgusted and scared by all of it. And Sophia only loves her at first because of her amazing hair. And then when Berenice actually jumps into the sea, her amazing hair becomes completely flat. And Sophia then loses all her love of her because she just looks like an ordinary child with really flat, dull hair. And essentially, Berenice has to go, which is a bit tragic. But Berenice is perhaps a kind of symbol of the civilized world, or people that can't quite cope with the amazingness of island life. Ben, great to see you. I wonder if you have read any Tove Jansson. Surely you've read some Moomin books, and if not, you must. Yeah, you're empathizing with the flat issue. It can be a passion killer, let's face it, when you're obsessed with someone for their amazing hair and then they get wet. And what can you do? Suddenly, they just look like a flat skull shaped person. So that's Berenice. She's a bit of a disaster. Then another character in the book is the Storm, Sophia's Storm. Sophia, the little girl, is having a lot of thoughts about life, death, the universe, her place in the world, how much power she has. But it's all very understated. And one thing that happens is she's having an incredibly boring few days when there's nothing going on. It's all very flat, dull sea, dull weather, hardly anything happening. And Sophia makes a wish that something dramatic will happen. And she wishes and prays really hard that there'll be some drama. And she then creates a storm. The storm did really happen, but of course, it wasn't really her storm. Or was it? So the chapter's called Sophia's Storm, and I'll just read you a little bit of it because it's a really great chapter and story. There was one summer that was never referred to by year, but only as the summer of the Great Storm, which also comes into the Moomin books, by the way. Not in human memory had such huge waves swept through the Gulf of Finland from the east. The winds reached 50, but the waves rose to a height and length that indicated 60, or some people insisted 70 knots. It happened on a weekend when the radio had predicted gentle variable winds. So boats were all rigged for good weather. That any of them escaped must be ascribed to God's mercy, for the storm came up in half an hour and built swiftly to its full intensity. Afterwards, government helicopters flew along the coast and plucked up people clinging to rocks or the bottoms of their swamped boats. The helicopters landed on every skerry where there was any trace of life or the simplest building and very carefully put down the name of the island and the names of the survivors on a list. If only people had known from the outset that everyone would be saved, they could have given the storm their full attention and admiration. For years afterwards, coastal people never met without talking about the storm, where they'd been that day, and what they'd done when the storm came up. The day started out warm, wrapped in a yellowish haze, and long swells moved through the sea in barely perceptible surges. Later, there was a great deal of talk about the yellow haze and the swell, and many people were reminded of the typhoons in their childhood sea stories. In addition, the water was unusually shiny and much lower than normal. And so it goes on. But Sophia then makes her massive wish that the storm will come. But then when it does come, and it's absolutely terrifying and massive and enormous, Sophia's completely horrified and scared. And grandmother keeps going on about all the terrible things that might happen in the storm. And Sophia feels that it's all her fault. And I just want to read you a little bit of that. Here we go. This is grandmother talking. I'm a little bit worried about the dory, and I can't remember if we closed the window. The dory, Sophia whispered. Yes, and the cold frames, and we never did stake the gladioli, and I left some pots soaking in the bay. Don't say any more, Sophia shouted. But grandmother continued on thoughtlessly. And then I keep thinking about all the people out at sea and all the boats that will be wrecked. Sophia stared at her and screamed, How can you talk like that when you know it's my fault? I prayed for a storm and it came. She started crying out loud as a caravan of dreadful, incriminating visions passed before her eyes. Broken boats and gladioli, windows and people, pots and pans, rolling about on the horizon of the sea, and flags shredded by the wind. Oh God! She saw everything shattered and destroyed. I think we did pull up the dory, by the way, Grandmother said. But Sophia wrapped her arms around her head and wept beneath the weight of the catastrophe that had struck all Eastern Ireland. It wasn't your fault, her grandmother said. Listen to me. There would have been a storm in any case. But not as big, Sophia wept. It was God and I who did it. So that is Sophia's Storm, which is quite near the end of the book. The other chapter that I really love in the book is The Enormous Plastic Sausage, which is all about how Sophia's papa is obsessed with getting enough water for his rather inappropriate plants that he's trying to grow on this very barren island, which is not suitable for gladioli and tomatoes. And so he keeps trying to water the plants and keep them alive. He doesn't have enough water, so he goes, he gets hold of this enormous plastic sausage, a huge rubbery type concept. God knows where you'd get that kind of thing. And he goes to the mainland to fill it up with fresh, sweet water, which he then does. And it's all an enormous drama when he gets the sausage filled up with water, and it's like a huge, massive sausage, probably as big as this room. And then he drags it into the water and pulls it behind the boat, in the water, all the way back to the island where they live by rope. And as they go along, the boat is practically sucked underwater by the enormous plastic sausage, and they do make it there, and it successfully manages to water the flowers. But of course, the minute they get it to the island, rain comes, so he didn't really have to do that after all. Those are the kind of stories that happen in the summer book. None of them are really major, massive dramas. It's a quiet book, and that's what I love about it, and that's what I think everyone that falls in love with it loves about it. It's going to have to slightly strip because suddenly I realise it's quite hot with all this chatting. So it does have storms. It does have a big sadness in the centre of it, which is the sadness of the loss of the little girl's mother. There's a lot of talk of death. There's a lot of talk of what might happen when you die. But there's also an acceptance of death. And I don't want to give it away, but there is a very kind of peaceful, happy, accepting, positive ending, which is a kind of an acceptance of mortality, which is a really great thing to read. And that's one of the reasons that it's also a great book that I often prescribe to people who are experiencing loss and grief. Tove Jansson, amazing writer. She, I've mentioned before, was the writer of the Moomins. This is a really great book all about her life, her art, and her words, which was written by Burl Weston, and it's very beautifully written. It has all these great chapters like Moomin Passion. It's Moomin Tales and Monumental Paintings. We have a lot about her early life. She had her first exhibition age 14. Frustratingly brilliant and driven woman that she was. And she was the daughter of a sculptor and a graphic designer. And her parents very much encouraged her to be her own person and do what she wanted to do, which is great. And she did go forth and become a brilliant and fantastic artist. And I think very much lived life in the way that she wanted and hoped to. She spent her whole life painting and drawing and also writing books. I think sometimes maybe the Moomin books took over her life a bit too much. And one of the bits I haven't mentioned by her is The True Deceiver, which is another novel by her, which is also fantastic, much darker than the summer book, mostly set in winter as well. And it's about a woman who is an artist who paints beautiful pictures of the woods, and she then puts what it sounds like a rather kitsch and sickly bunny rabbits in the woods. And I feel that artist is very much based on Tove's real life. And she, the artist in the novel, gets completely taken over by her own talent and by the people that want her to keep creating these, what sound like maybe rather dreadful but brilliant paintings. Obviously, Tove didn't feel like that about her own Moomin books, but she might have felt a bit overwhelmed by them. And in The True Deceiver, the artist kind of gets rather taken advantage of by the woman who is her accountant. But I won't give things away about that. It's another great book. But I also just wanted to show you some of Tove's lovely illustrated books about the Moomins. These are ones that are using her pictures and her words, and are they for kids? Are they for adults? I'd say they're definitely for both. They're great to read to kids, but they're also great to read as an adult too. And then she also wrote these fantastic comic strip books. So she did comic strips in the Finnish newspaper over a period of years, and they were then compiled into books. And these might look like they're designed for kids with all the lovely Moomin characters, but they're very much politically satirical strips which are talking about present day events, and they make for really interesting reading as well, and they're kind of not what you expect them to be at all. Then we also have these amazing books of hers that I really love, which are just fantastically designed with all these really gorgeous graphic illustrations, which I love so much that I've painted as murals in my children's rooms over the years. But now they're teenagers and they're about to be painted over, which is a bit tragic. I'll take photos of them and preserve them forevermore. So that was The Summer Book by Tove Jansson, an amazing book, massively recommended. Great for reading right now because it takes you through the whole season of summer to the end of the summer, and it ends in a very satisfying way. And I feel like summer's only just ended here. Summer seemed to go on forever with our strange and very hot September. So I feel it's a perfect time to read it if you're feeling nostalgic for the summer and you want some lovely positive vibes and to be taken into a world of nature, and you might fantasize about going to live on an island in the middle of nowhere next summer, maybe on the Finnish archipelago, or maybe Scotland or the Scilly Islands. I will be returning for more Bibliotherapy Live, maybe next week. I'm sorry I've been a bit absent the last few weeks. Summer just got really complicated. There's been all sorts of madness going on. Wednesday night suddenly seemed to be tricky for various reasons, but I will be back hopefully next Wednesday. If not next Wednesday, definitely the one after. Very sadly, we're no longer doing the Damien Barr Literary Salon Facebook Lives because Damien is saying goodbye to the Literary Salon for now, which so that he can concentrate on his own books. So I won't be appearing on Damien's Facebook for his Literary Salon because that is going to be no longer functioning. But I will no doubt be continuing to work with Damien in other ways, and there will be other events in the future. So I will be purely here on Facebook and on Instagram Live and on YouTube. You can find all my videos on YouTube after the event because I publish them there. But do send in any requests, comments, ideas for themes that you would like me to cover in Bibliotherapy Live. One that I'm going to do quite soon is going to be gambling. I had a request from Laura to do gambling in literature, which I think is a very interesting one. I've also had a request to do perfection in literature, which I think is a great idea. The search for perfection, striving for perfection, feeling weighed down by needing to be perfect. And I will also be looking at spooky stories around Halloween, which I'm really looking forward to. So thanks for joining me this evening. I'm going to end now, but don't forget also that you can book bibliotherapy sessions with me direct by going to my website, find my email, send me a message, and we can book a bibliotherapy session one-to-one where I can then advise you about what to read right now, depending on what you love to read, what you hate to read, and what's going on in your life. So, lovely to see you. Thanks for joining me. See you soon. Good night.